I'm going to start off with just a kind of a question that sort of interests me. I've talked to a lot of people in the industry about the future and where we're going. And about 10 years ago, I remember doing an interview with an executive at one of the US automakers, and he cautioned me not to get too optimistic about the future. He said, when you look back at what we were talking about 10 years ago and what we're talking about now and it happened in 10 years, we're still driving cars that have 4 wheels, and we're still driving cars that have a steering wheel, and nothing radically has changed. And so, I sort of kind of keep that in my head sometimes when I think about the future a little bit, and I want to know, what do you guys think? What do you think, are we really entering an era where things are going to be radically different for most people? Or is it going to be pockets of places where things are different? Or, I'd really like to see what each one of you thinks we're going to be driving and moving around in 20 years. Let's start with you, Margo.
With me, yeah. Actually, I think we're already seeing the revolution when it comes to automobile technology. Back 20 years ago, we were all excited about the GM EV1. And what would have happened if General Motors stuck with it? What the progress would have been in the meantime. So I think we're seeing the revolution. We're seeing lighter weight materials. We're seeing smaller engines, turbocharging, more clean internal combustion engines. We're seeing all these models of electric cars, fuel cells in California, hybrids. That will continue, but also what will continue is the social trends that many of us talk about today. Back when you remember the telephone, you're thinking of a telephone just sitting there. Somebody calls, eventually we'll take a message, but that's about it. It's like a vase that holds the flowers. Look at our iPhone today. It does pretty much everything for us. I think the same thing's going to happen with cars. We're going to drive more cars that are shared, on demand. They're going to be cleaner, they're going to be lighter, they will have electric powertrain.
Anne-Marie?
Yeah, a couple of things. The word radical is overused, and the word disruptive is overused. I think when you look at how much things have changed, I think the important thing to focus on is what the experience is. So when I was a kid growing up in this country, it was very common to drive on highways and see litter everywhere. That was very normal. You would see smokestacks everywhere, very normal. Streets were a lot dirtier, very normal. The Clean Air Act happened. Public consciousness about mitigating the effects of pollution happened. Alternatives became at least a single-digit percentage of grid power, and there was a shift. You could say that in my lifetime, that there's been a radical change, but the reality is there are always pockets of things going on, especially in this big country, that's so technology-centric, that really upend the apple cart, that really change the way people live. Going forward, I don't think that having 4 wheels and a steering wheel qualifies as the same technology. That's my point of view. I think how it changes in terms of the full life cycle analysis and how it changes in terms of the driver experience, those things are much more important than whether or not there's a steering wheel or 4 wheels. And that has changed. I think to point out that these are decisions based on time scales, I would probably bring in that theme again, that companies can decide what to work on. A common refrain, or in some cases a dodge, is that we're making what our customers want. That's fine. But one of the most successful restaurant chains in history, McDonald's, had a theory that was around training your customer. And really what underlies that is education. If you're working on a technology that is demonstrably better for society in 10 years, 20 years, not to fund that, not to pursue that, is actually a wrong decision economically. It just depends on the time scale that you do that calculation over. So I think even though we talk a lot now, especially with Internet of Everything, Internet of Things, about the rapidity of change in the way people use technology, the reality is the investments in the infrastructure and the underlying pieces of technology actually have to lengthen in order to achieve that.
Thank you very much. Valérie?
So I think that definitely for the past 20 years, what we have foreseen was more incremental type of innovation. companies were just doing better, and the market was responding positively. Now, really, there is converging forces to go to a different kind of innovation, breakthrough innovation, and I think that these converging forces are obviously technology. I think that technology really allows for the new definition of business model specifically, and this is what we mentioned. I think that science and engineering is key whenever it is merged with new business model, and this is how really we will be able to get to a new generation of experience. The consumer is here again. Now the consumer is expecting something different, which was not the case again 5 or 10 years ago. I was talking to you this morning about my mobility experience when I was 18. So I'm from the Alps, in a very small city, and when I was 18, getting my driver license and getting my car was the meaning of freedom. You were free whenever you had your car because you were free to go anywhere you wanted to. Now living in Paris, like 70% of the population will live in the city in 2015. When I get my car, what is my feeling? Congestion. This is what I experience. And I'm ready to change for any type of other mobility because I don't want to experience that. What I want to experience is mobility and not congestion. And so I think that really consumer is here because of physical constraint that we are experiencing from the infrastructure, physical constraint that we're experiencing from the city. So those technology, consumer being here, more and more pressure on physical constraint will make things happen faster.
Thank you. And Jean?
I always hate going last in a great panel. So I want to come at it from a slightly different thing. 2 points. One, I think we already are very different in terms of how we think about and access mobility solutions. I may be using the same car, but when I get up in the morning, I check my calendar on my smartphone. I go to see where my first appointment is. I bring it up on Google Maps and see what the roads look like. And then based on that, I decide what time do I actually start to get ready and have to leave the house. I'm already behaving differently around mobility just because of my smartphone, even though I'm using the same car. Now when my car is doing that for me, it will have another impact. The second idea that I want to kind of introduce is that the other way I see the differences is in the workforce at NextEnergy. We're a little teeny tiny 25-person organization, but we have about 6 20-somethings and about 4 50 and 60-somethings. So almost half the organization are the ends of the continuum around the working age population. The ideas that flow back and forth in terms of how we think about getting around between those two are really fun. I mean, we had to put bike racks in because 20% of our people regularly commute to work by bike. Wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. So I'm already seeing differences just by working with younger people. And then I'm going to go for 3 points. The third point is we sit here in Southeast Michigan where we have lots of land and we have a personally owned auto mindset and driven economy. And my biggest fear is that we miss the pace at which these urgent solutions are being sought because we don't really see the congestion problems, the scarcity problems that the mega cities actually already are experiencing. So we've got really smart people working on really great, really challenging problems, but they don't have that urgent personal experience because of the luxury of land that we have in Southeast Michigan. And so figuring out how to light a fire under that innovation community that gets at the Paris or the Beijing or the Nigeria issues is critical for our innovation community.
That's actually really interesting. It was leading me to my next question, so I'll let you go first on that.
Oh, okay.
I work at Autoblog, and we deal with a lot of consumers, and we also deal with a lot of car enthusiasts. And historically, enthusiasts and the folks who really love cars, they're the folks who are here in Southeast Michigan working on development, but they're also the ones who actually pay for a lot of new technology, right? They're the ones who want the next best engine. They're the ones who want the upgrades in their car, and they pay those higher costs that then sort of flow through the industry and subsidize a lot of development. So if we're talking about developing cars which are sort of you know, I don't own it, I just come into it, so I don't necessarily need leather seats. I don't own it, and so I might not even pay for adaptive cruise control. I'm not really that excited about it, so, you know, I'm not going to spend $30,000, $40,000 on something like that. How is that sort of economic factor going to ripple through the industry, and is that something that we should be concerned about? Like, where are the enthusiasts in this, and does that have a financial impact?
I think that's exactly the issue that I have a lot of concern about, is that we have our most seasoned decision makers in this industry are informed by the car enthusiast community, but that's not the mobility solutions market. And figuring out how to take the best of what the car enthusiast community thinks about, aspires to, and gets excited about, and what broader mobility solutions really require, and figuring out the technology roadmaps that make sense for both of those. Because my biggest fear is we end up with a very small, very elite niche market of personally owned autos. I mean, if you think about 9 billion people on the planet someday, maybe we'll end up with a few 100 million cars, maybe, right? We may already be halfway to the total size of the car market if you start looking at numbers and thinking about it. So how do we take the best and brightest ideas from car enthusiasts and help tone them into what's the consumer version that actually makes sense? And then what are the economics and the technology roadmaps to get them to market so they make sense?
Do you find people are actually talking about that and thinking about that, or is that something that you're trying to push?
It's really interesting, because what I see working with the auto OEMs is they all have really great groups, typically younger, of folks that are working on, you know, urban mobility solutions or advanced mobility ideas, and they're really excited about the multimodal devices, but also the alternative business models. And they're really excited about the startups in that space and the way to think about it. And then you have the R&D, mainline R&D in the company that are more traditional auto people. And oftentimes those two groups don't mix much. And part of it is the timeline they're working on. These guys are working on shortening a 7-year development cycle for a real product that has to sell to real people. These guys are working on what might happen in 15 years and not even sure what the business model is, let alone the business case. So how do we bring those two together more regularly to help accelerate both? Right. Is the challenge.
Henry, do you see anything in this? I mean, in the green sector, it seems like there is a bit of enthusiasts there. There are folks who are ready to adopt that and pay premium prices for that. Do you see any of those concerns in the battery market?
Of course, it's a great question. Enthusiasts in clean tech have been absolutely essential in allowing my company and companies like ours to exist and thrive. Absolutely essential. People who are willing to be early adopters, who are willing to test the technology, absolutely essential. The interesting thing is that from a profitability standpoint, from a does it pencil standpoint, from a quarterly profit standpoint, you have to balance or make these two things meet up, right? One is the device scale, which is, do I have the device I want? The other is the infrastructure scale, which is, am I using the device in an infrastructure that I have access to? My personal daily driver is a Mazda Miata. I love the whole experience. I love the fresh air, even if it's a little cold in Michigan, and it's an experience for me, the commute. If I didn't have to commute, if I could order up a self-driving car and pack in different and more varied experiences on my way to work or wherever I need to go, I would do so. That option is not yet available. So the notion that people are simply selecting the device they want right now in defiance of the existing infrastructure is not right. If the existing infrastructure changes, the device choice will change. Now, in terms of clean tech and in terms of electric vehicles, the difference in the user experience is profound. And it's not only profound for that driver, it's also profound environmentally. Previously, we were talking about pulling up to a four-way stop and seeing only electric vehicles and hearing nothing. Clive was saying that before, and I thought it was a really good insight. It changes not only the personal driving experience, but it changes the experience of living in a city of any size. Now, because of the land use issue, because we are where we are, the reality is the crowding is not there, the density is not there. It doesn't mean it's not noticeable. And more importantly, the experience of not having to go to the gas station, the experience of being able to calculate where my energy for my vehicle came from is actually very valuable. That's actually been undervalued by utilities and even government to some extent. There have been papers and policies and a lot of ink and a lot of airtime given to the fact that people are so surprised that consumers would expect this. I think that the reality that people are willing to think 5, 10 years in advance has been surprising, but only because the timescale consideration was wrong. The company, the corporate infrastructure might believe the only thing that matters is quarterly, maybe semi-annually, annually. But the reality is that the vast majority of consumers, when given the choice about selecting something that's basically in parity with an existing solution that is a more sustainable solution, offers a great option. So I think that needs to be explored, and it would be great to see people in technology enunciating that better, enunciating that long-term benefit.
Valérie, I'm interested in your perspective on my next question. In the U.S., we have a lot of debates about government investment in new technologies, especially green technologies. We're actually kind of sitting next to one example that comes up in quite a few debates. And in the U.S., we talk a lot about is the government the right place to look for investment in new technology? You know, as Cheryl Connolly said in her speech, like 90% of all new tech startups fail. And taxpayers sometimes question, is that a good use of taxpayer money to be putting it into startups and putting into these risky businesses? And I know that globally there are different perspectives on this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. What's the right mix of funding for new technology?
Well, I think that obviously when the government decides to fund an initiative, it's because he wants to accelerate it. And why does he need to accelerate it? Because he feels like the market is not ready. Obviously, you don't need public funding whenever you find your market, you find your R&D, and you don't need that public funding. So I think that it's true that one of the challenges is business models, and people are thinking a lot about business model. And think about the renewable energy sector. It's not as affordable in terms of cost of production as some other processes that are more mature. So the government feels that it has to fund it. We had in France, and it was the same, you mentioned failure. In France, we had large initiatives to fund the wind energy sector and the solar panel sector. So it was both funding the research of companies as well as subsidizing the equipment of houses. It just created a bubble, okay? And so people got equipped with some solar panel. There was plenty of companies that started a business on solar panel. After 5 or 6 years, there was only 20% left. 80% went bankrupt. And so finding the right model between government investment and private investment, ultimately what we need to make sure is that there is a market for it and that there is an adoption by the market and that we don't create too much of a product and eventually create the bubble. So, but I believe that the government has a role to play in funding initiative. We have collaborative program type of funding between large corporations, small startups, and research academia. This is how the EU funding program works. And these create the ecosystem. And in that sense, I think it's efficient. Obviously, there is also lots of startups that don't go and find a model, but the focus here is for the industry to kind of open its ecosystem to startup and to think that they will not develop everything themselves. So those type of funding of consortia where the objective is to have a startup blooming with a collaboration with the industry, academia, and so on, proves to be efficient. So definitely, government needs to be cautious. It cannot replace, it does not create a market. The government does not create a market. Companies do.
Great. Margo, do you have any thoughts on that?
You know, again, depends what type of investments and for what purpose we're talking about for government investments. If you look at the transportation sector, over 90% of the energy sources is oil. So in the past, we have been talking about energy security. You know, we want to get away from oil because of energy security. These days are talking about climate change. And I want to add the third reason, which is an economic reason. Probably the transportation sector and oil is the only sector where oil has monopoly. So if we don't like the prices, gasoline prices, we really have no choice. What are we going to do? You cannot use another product. You don't have low carbon fuels. Until very recently, you didn't have hybrids. You didn't have efficient vehicles. So you can see all the studies that clearly have shown that GDP is going up and down depending on gasoline prices. So we as a country, for all these three reasons, for energy security, for climate change, and for the fact that we cannot rely solely on oil, we have to get away from oil. And the government has a very big role to play to help us with green energy technologies. We have done it for oil, and we have spent trillions of dollars, and we still do. I think on an annual basis, we spend about $45 billion to subsidize the oil industry. After over a century of investments, we have the infrastructure in place. So clearly, there is a very big role that the government must play on green technologies, from lightweight materials, carbon fiber, magnesium, electric powertrains, both motors and batteries, fuel cells, and hydrogen and infrastructure. We have to do it. Other countries are doing the same. So it's a must for all these three reasons: economic, environmental, and national security.
Okay. You mentioned in your speech that at some point, I think in 2050, we might be looking at cars that are getting 180 miles per gallon on CAFE and should be zero emission. How much political pressure do you think that those kinds of really lofty goals will face? And a sort of second subset of that, are the goals that are out there right now for 54.5 CAFE standards, are they at risk once the administration switches over? I mean, if the Democrats are not in power, is there a risk that might be lowered?
Yeah, so very good question. So let me start with the last one. The 54.5, it's really 40 miles per gallon based on the real world, driving experience. And if you look at 2025, we're going to get there mostly. 99% of what we expect is going to be improved internal combustion engine. So the program rely only for 1 to 3% strong hybrids and electric vehicles. So that shows you how much progress exists to improve the energy of the internal combustion engine with lightweight materials, with smaller engines, turbocharging, better lubricants, and so forth. And the consumer is responding. In 2014, car companies introduced more vehicles on the road than what the standards require, meeting the standards. So actually, 34% of the vehicles in 2014 met the 2016 standards. So there is a process by which the government is going to have to look at what we call midterm review, the 2025 standards. I'm pretty confident that the standards will stay in place, despite the fact that the industry, and we already have heard the discussions, that we cannot meet the standards. The standards are fleet-based, so if you have a very small car, you have to do more to make it more efficient, but you have a big truck, you have to do less to make it more efficient. So I'm very confident that after the regulatory process, the standards will stay in place. But let me say this, the 2025 standard is just the first step towards addressing climate change. So, and we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. We don't have to wait 10 years and 20 years. We're seeing more floods, we're seeing more drought, we're seeing more fires, we're seeing more catastrophic events across the planet, not just the US. So the question then is, how are we going to avert the worst impacts of climate change? Not how we're going to avert it completely, but the impacts are already happening. So what do we need to do as a society? And what we know, based on the scientific community, is that we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in 2050 by 80% from the 2000 levels. So if you translate that for cars, what does it mean? It means that all cars, not just new cars, in 2050 should be zero emissions. So how difficult that is, that's going to be pretty challenging. But there are going to be a lot of things beyond electric cars. I think you're going to see lightweight materials. Also, you're going to see the social trends, as we discussed earlier. Not everybody's going to own a car. You're not going to have 9 billion people in the planet owning cars. You know that mega cities are already, many cities, they're not allowing vehicles to go into the center of the city, or they're taxing them. If you live in Germany, depending where you're driving, you're going to get taxed based on the car that you're driving. So you're going to see all these factors to play in to reduce the emissions from the transportation sector.
Anne-Marie, how much does political pressures in the U.S., how does that affect your business? Is that something you need to take into account, sort of political will on where that's going when you invest as much money as you are into technologies like solid-state batteries?
Some companies do. We don't happen to. We've raised a little north of $50 million for the business. $3 million of that was in the form of a retention grant by the state of Michigan to compel us to stay in Michigan versus move to one of the coasts. On that grant, it was performance-based. The requirements were pretty simple. Build your roles, employ people, stay, and of course, develop the technology. We met all of our milestones, and we were able to also fund a life cycle analysis study. So I believe we turned in a very capable performance for the state taxpayers. It doesn't always go very well. Now, can I comment on the individual choices? I cannot. I mean, human beings make decisions. Human beings, like me, like all of us, make mistakes. I think the more important question is, what happens to all the material that we're producing? If you look at the utilization and you look at the energy structures that we use versus the energy structures that we fund and we create, the reality is that not only to address climate change, but also very critical quality of life issues, we're just not going to make as much in the transportation industry. It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable economically, it's not sustainable ecologically, it's not sustainable from lifestyle choices. So the question really becomes, how are we going to make, store, and utilize energy? Now, does government have a role to play? Yes. Government ideally should do a longer term calculation. Should do a 7th or 10th generation calculation. Is that feasible in light of how we fund campaigns and elections? I don't know. I think that's a more fundamental question for the electorate. When you have to constantly be raising in order to keep your job, there is a real Faustian bargain possible where you have to satisfy a short-term responsibility funded by incumbents to keep your seat. So if I'm speaking plainly or too plainly, I apologize for that. But I think that there are fundamental questions that the electorate should be asking about how we elect officials. Nonetheless, the electorate is getting smarter and smarter. If you look at public surveys and people's sophistication in answering those things, I completely reject the idea that the public is somehow not competent. I find that patently untrue. I have the privilege, because of what we do at the company, to be able to speak to public audiences, and uniformly I receive very thoughtful questions, not only from the people who have time to come in the middle of the day to something like this, but also people who blog, who email our Info Sastry site, who email me. I don't find that people are dangerously naive or somehow uninformed. I actually think the average working person in the United States completely understands the timescale effect. And like me, she or he might select a different device and probably would if a different infrastructure were available. So connecting those two things, the availability of people who will enunciate what needs to be enunciated in the public sector in order so that you can feel comfortable casting a vote, and connecting that with how we finance these things, and also lengthening the time scale, to me, seem very important. But I don't believe that a fundamental issue is a lack of understanding in the electorate. That's just not been my experience.
This will be my last political question, but I do think it's an important one. Let's talk about global warming and this debate that sort of keeps going on, and at least in the U.S., and I know we've been sort of made fun of in other international communities because we keep debating this topic. How distracting is that to making progress on these very ambitious goals of sustainability? If we're continually sort of debating whether or not something is actually happening, how do we plan for it?
Can I say a couple of things? First of all, we try not to say global warming because you come to Michigan and they say, well, my climate is not warming, it's cold here. so really, it's the change of climate, although the surface of the Earth's temperature has warmed. So, the majority of the public in the US believes, one, that there is a climate change, and two, that human actions are responsible for building greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So that's a given, and you see that every year to be improving. The people's understanding. It's like 10 years ago, you could not talk about same-sex marriage. Today, it's accepted across the country. I see the same thing happening, regardless if they're Republicans or Democrats. The public believes that it's happening and we're responsible. And also they're seeing the immediate effects. 2012, we spent $112 million in the country addressing climate-related impacts. So the people get it. The question here is, are we going to scare them off that there are no solutions? Because if you go to the public and you say, you know what, we're going to reduce the carbon emissions from utility plants, from coal-burning facilities. But what that means is that in the state of Michigan, you're not going to have electricity for X days, or your electricity is going to go up by 20%. Then people have so many other issues to deal with. They're thinking about, really, can we do something that's not going to cost us that much money? The same thing on transportation. I mean, what you hear is that 2025 is going to require all of us to drive an electric car. That's not the case. The case is that 2025 is going to be met just improving the internal combustion engine. So it will look kind of naive when we go overseas. I mean, when I travel overseas, and I was in China recently, people are asking me, why does your Congress deny that there's climate change? So there may be some in Congress that deny there's climate change, but I think the public overall believes that it's happening. We are responsible and we need to do something about it. But that's where innovation comes into play. How do we address climate change impacts? By innovation and reducing cost of mitigating actions for climate change. And I think that's, in my mind, the issue at hand.
Jean, do you have a perspective on that?
I'll probably get in trouble. So the basic question is the current debate over climate change a distraction?
Yes.
Yes. It sucks the air out of the room. It creates a bimodal conversation as opposed to where are the common areas, what can we agree on, and how can we move forward based on what we agree on. So yes, it is a distraction. And I think it's magnified by it's magnified and also rectified by the fact that we actually don't do national energy policy well. We do energy policy at a very local level. So even though we're having these debates in Congress about climate change, the state of Florida is planning for resiliency and sea level rises. They can't use climate change or global warming in any of their reports, the words, but they're working with local, county, and municipal governments to plan for resiliency, energy systems, transportation systems, and building codes. So we have this weird thing going on where the federal agencies are embroiled, but the local units of government are just moving on anyway. I mean, the number of cities across the country that have sustainability officers, they get together regularly and do the sustainability planning, the resiliency work, the actual local ordinance work that enables technology deployment that will deal with some of the issues of climate change.
Thank you for your honesty on that one. We have a question from from the audience, and I think that this might be a good question for everybody to chime in on. I was wondering, do you guys all feel anything about being a woman, that this attracts you to sustainability work somehow? Or do we bring different strengths or talents or perspectives to sustainability work? Look at Valérie.
Well, I'm a feminist by heart, but no, I don't believe that. I think it's a bit of a cliche to say that women cares about sustainability because we have children, because we think long term, and so on, whereas men would be more short term and don't care that much about the kids. But so I don't like this type of cliche, but it is true that whenever we look at the study, we run some study in the engineering school because we all have the same issue of developing new engineers skills and talent, and making sure that kids actually go to engineering school, because we have a shortage in Europe as well, just like you have here in the US. And when you run the studies towards boys and girls about what they believe is the next challenges of engineering that they would like to solve being an engineer, girls will talk a lot about renewable energy and sustainability challenge. So I think that rather it might be true that engineering and science, and I'm a failed scientist. I was great in science up to high school, lack a role model to go to science and engineering and turn into a lawyer. So I'm a great example of why I was strong in math and physics and did not go to engineering school, because of lack of role models. And because at that time, and it's a bit of, now, if I had to go back, I feel like being a scientific and engineering, you can really make a difference. Being a lawyer also, positive a difference, but being a scientific and engineers, you can make a difference in creating and innovating. And it's true that those girls, they're thinking, why do I innovate for? What do I solve as a global challenge? Rather than just, how do I increase performance, efficiency? No, why do I do it? And maybe the women bring this kind of perspective, and at least I think that it's a great way to attract girls to engineering and scientific schools.
You were nodding a lot, so
No, it's true. I mean, you know, I mentor many young women when I was at EPA, and the first question was, how did you know that you wanted to work in the environmental field? And I wish I could say, well, I was born to be an environmentalist. You know, for me, I studied engineering, which is, was very unusual back when I was a baby and I graduated from college, and it's still very challenging. But I went to EPA 32 years ago because I had my first child and I didn't want to travel. And before that, I was doing consulting for the private sector. So that's how I started my environmental career. I could not have written it in any better way. Feel blessed, regardless of politics, that I woke up every day and I knew I'm making a difference in somebody's life. You know, my girls used to say, Mom, after I came back from a public hearing, you don't have any friends. Everybody's yelling at you. You know? So I said, yeah, but I do have some friends, and it's all of you guys because I'm helping, you know, to have a safer environment. But the truth of the matter is, when you look in the, you know, for engineers in the environmental field, you don't see that many. And I have traveled across the planet, visiting with the, you know, the car companies, truck companies, airplanes, everything that moves and pollutes, that, including fuel that we regulated. Unfortunately, there are not many women engineers in that field, which is unfortunate because I think we as mothers, and I have two, you know, adult daughters, we do care, not that men don't care, but we do care about the environment, we do care about the food, we do care about, you know, telling our kids to eat better and to eat and to exercise. So I think there may be some sort of a natural tendency to be more protective if you're a mother, but I have some of the best men working for me that they were brilliant, they care about the environment, they work 24/7, so I really cannot say necessarily that being a woman, you're a better sustainability or an environmentalist person. I think that's a responsibility for all of us, regardless of our sex, race, or religious beliefs. We have a responsibility, even if we don't work on this field, to support and help for the next generation to come, because it's their future. So what we're doing today, using all the resources and just building our big houses, driving our big cars, you know, really spending 25% of oil when we represent only 5% of the population, we're really taking away from the future generations. So we, as parents, as individuals, we have a responsibility to protect the planet for them.
Anne-Marie, do you have a perspective on this?
I do. I think it's interesting how what you expect to hear can be amplified in a discussion and even in your memory. If you expect a person of a certain demographic group to be talking about something, then that expectation is met even partially. Afterward, it has a tendency to amplify your recollection of that event, that speech, that lecture, that discussion, whatever it is. It's also interesting that people tend to talk about what is amplified afterward. So if you as an individual represent a certain demographic group, you discuss something and you're credited for talking about that thing, natural tendency is to talk about that thing more. Those are fairly general statements. Now, to the specific question of the effect, I would say there are two key effects in women and sustainability, if you like. One is the demographic expectation I talked about, that it is not surprising to anyone that the notion that women will consider sustainability either from a subtle bias or a subtle expectation or whatever it is, but that's not surprising. It's also not surprising that it is a fairly welcoming environment among scientists and engineers for women to enunciate their interest in a certain field because of some driver that's due to society or due to well-being. So that's not surprising to people. So I think it tends to be remembered. I think that actually does males a disservice in some regards. My husband, Christian Listowski, is a professor of environmental engineering and runs the environmental program in civil environmental engineering at Michigan. And he cares very deeply about this. He cares very deeply about the math and science behind this. So I think that it's important for all of us to recognize not only the intent in what problems people elect to work on and give due credit for that and reward that as a way of encouraging more people to get into science and engineering, but also credit the scientific underpinnings and the logistics of carrying out that work, regardless of gender or race or whatever. The second thing I would say is that by the same token, it's important not to miss the contributions of different demographic groups. When I was a professor and now at Sastry 3, I have had an opportunity to work with an enormously diverse group of people. At the company, we've had people from 7 countries. As a professor, I welcome people from many more into my laboratory, all races, genders, orientations, countries of origin, et cetera. And it would be facile to say, everybody's the same. Everybody thinks the same. Everybody has identical potential. Everybody comes at this with the exact same mindset. That's just wrong. Actually, students who hailed from countries, and particularly students who hailed from megacities, had a completely different perspective on what the important technology problem was that needed solving. And that's incredibly valuable. So it would be a mistake to just sort of go arm's length of this whole demographic discussion by saying everybody's the same. Everybody's not the same. Our experiences shape us. Our origins shape us. What people expect us to talk about shapes what we work on. What I notice as a final comment in our children's generation is that just very common and pervasive biases don't exist anymore. They really don't. It's not dolls for girls and action figures for boys. It's the pervasive bias, the pervasive expectational differences between genders among races have really, really diminished. We still have big challenges in this country, at least, on getting to the next step, which is really a bias-free environment. But in my experience in the US, it's vastly different.
Thank you. And Jean, we're going to end with you. Do you have any thoughts?
I've been thinking about this question since you asked it. And I think about my role as more one around energy, innovation, and manufacturing. So my world is usually with mostly men. So it's kind of interesting to think about the idea that, oh, when we put together a sustainability voice, it's easy to populate a panel with women. And I hadn't really thought about that before, so I think I'm going to have to spend more time. For me, I've chosen energy field and specifically the role of innovation and commercialization because I think it's one of the biggest problems we have to solve. I think it's one of those places where the challenge is really engaging and the possibilities are really engaging. And so spending my life's energy that way makes sense for me. I think one of the things I've been seeing in my career span so far is that the willingness for more of my male colleagues to be investing their life's energy in what's important to them, making a difference, has gone way up. You know, I'm old enough to still live in the era of having secretaries and martini lunches, right? That world is gone. So working alongside male colleagues who are 20 years younger than me, or 25 or 30 years younger than me, and seeing how they approach their life choices, and seeing them much more similar to how my female colleagues approach their life choices, and much more similar to how I approached my life choices compared to how my father approached his. That, to me, speaks of the promise that it's more about individuals choosing individual fields based on their individual gifts and their individual passions than it is about this field is more inviting or lucrative for a female role, and this field is more inviting or lucrative for a male role.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for spending so much time with us this morning. I found this whole conversation from start to end to be quite fascinating. And that ends the whole discussion for the day. We're going to take a break, and then there is lunch upstairs for anyone who is hungry. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.